All right, we're live.
We're live?
Yep.
Hey guys, we're live. We're live. I've been talking and we weren't loaded. Hey, thanks for being on. Bill Cassidy here. Thanks for being on Facebook Live to discuss the infrastructure package, which is an historic investment in things that are incredibly important to Louisiana. That is going to create hundreds of thousands or even millions of jobs directly and indirectly. That is going to create a bigger economy and a lower rate of inflation, according to the Wharton School of Business's analysis over 30 years, and which we think is plausibly said to be paid for. Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there. This is my chance to speak to you directly as regards these questions, and I so appreciate you being on. Now, I may get called out for votes because the Democrats have put up their $3.5 trillion budget-busting tax and spend extravaganza, and so I may have to pop back and forth to vote. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. And that comment, and by the way, if you log on, you know how to ask the questions. I have a screen right now, and this screen is giving me the questions that you're asking, and so this gives me the chance to answer them. So, but it also sets up the first question from Scott. Is this bill tied to the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill? And that's been one of the kind of questions. If we pass infrastructure, does it make it more likely to pass the tax and spend extravaganza that Bernie Sanders is writing? And I think the best logic is that the answer is absolutely not. Let me elaborate. One of my Democratic colleagues on the House side said, you know, infrastructure is dessert. That $3.5 trillion record spending, record taxing bill is spinach. Why am I going to eat my spinach if I already have my dessert? Pretty good logic, right? And you know, someone who accepts that logic is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. The Senate Majority Leader voted for the $1.2 trillion package. Now, you may not like Mitch, you may not trust Mitch, but there is no better analyst of how to better achieve Republican goals in Congress than Mitch McConnell. And he thinks that passing this bill makes it less likely that that the Democrats are able to pass their $3.5 trillion tax and spend extravaganza. I hate that bill, but I love our infrastructure bill. And I love it for many reasons, one of which I think it makes it less likely. By the way, if Scott were here, he might say, well, wait a second. Is it possible that Nancy Pelosi will attempt to tie them together? Yeah, it's possible, but I can tell you there's a lot of folks on the other side who don't want to. And even that question begs the next thing. If you did tie them together, it makes it more likely to pass the $3.5 trillion. Think about it. Pelosi doesn't have her votes now to pass it. That's why she wants to. So on the one hand, I hear, wait a second, you pass $1.2 trillion, it makes it easier to pass $3.5 trillion tax and spend extravaganza. And on the other, I hear, wait a second, she is going to tie the two together in order to pass her 3.5. In a sense, folks can see the argument that the 1.2 trillion is what the American people want. The 3.5 trillion tax and spend extravaganza, adding to inflation, is what the American people don't want. And tying and untying them, we get the infrastructure without the other. Hey, Scott, thank you so much. Next question. Why are we spending money on things like roads and on rails, on Amtrak, for example, when folks don't use Amtrak? Well, the people in the Northeast or elsewhere might ask, why are we spending $4.5 billion on coastal restoration targeted to areas recently hit by natural disasters? By the way, that's a provision in the bill that doesn't mention Louisiana, but has Louisiana written all over it. There's $4.5 billion in coastal restoration targeted to communities hit by natural disasters in the previous 6 years. And somebody from, let's think about it, Wisconsin Might say, well, why do we need that? Well, the fact is, this is a bill for the entire country. There are areas in the Northeast in which they use a lot of Amtrak. And then there's areas in the Gulf Coast that have been hit by natural disasters. This is a bill which attempts to address concerns across the country. And there is a lot in there to help Louisiana. One more example, by the way. FEMA gets $3.5 billion for flood mitigation efforts. $3.5 billion for communities that have recently had issues with flooding. You never flood, you're in Denver, you might say, why do we have that? You're in Louisiana, and you think, my gosh, I remember 2016. If you're in Southwest Louisiana, I remember last year. And now we get some relief. So this is a bill for the entire nation. But by the way, on that rail, it also helps freight rail. And freight rail is key to our economy growing. And Louisiana is blessed with lots of freight rail supporting our industry. And that freight rail creates jobs and kind of is good for us too. So just to make that point. Next from Aaron. Aaron says, only 23% of this infrastructure bill is for infrastructure. Well, no, but Aaron, that's not true, respectfully. This is hard infrastructure. It doesn't have the kind of social spending that you're reading about in the $3.5 trillion bill. It is hard infrastructure, or those things necessary to help hard infrastructure. For example, let me just give you a list. I have them here. There's and this will get you above 23% very quickly. There is 110 billion for roads and bridges, 110 billion for roads, 40 billion for bridges, 65 billion for broadband, 65 billion for hardening the grid. There's 54 billion for water infrastructure, 46 billion for resiliency, including Army Corps of Engineer projects, 25 billion for airport improvements, 47 billion for public transportation, 17.4 billion for coastal, inland, and land port waterways. I could keep on going. So for those that say that I could give you, boom, off the top of my head, 500 billion. Well, it's a $1.2 billion package over 5 years. Clearly more than 23% is related to hard infrastructure. Now, some of the stuff you might say, I've heard there's Green New Deal stuff in here. Stuff to help the environment. Well, let's talk about that. There's about 13 billion off the top of my head for cleaning up chemical waste sites. 13 billion for chemical waste sites. Louisiana has 27 such sites on the national priority list. And one of them, for example, and by the way, part of the rationale of cleaning them up is that at times you can't build infrastructure unless you clean up the chemical waste site. For example, the Calcasieu River Ship Channel, the new bridge. It is the west bank of the Calcasieu River Ship Channel has a chemical Superfund site there that has to be cleaned up before you can build a bridge. This provides money that could be used to clean up that site, which keeps you from otherwise being able to build the bridge. There's a chemical called PFAS, which is in airports. It used to be used by the armed forces for a flame retardant. The plane catches on fire, you spray it around, but it got into the dirt. Before you can lengthen your runway, you gotta clean up the PFAS. And so you gotta have some environmental mediation in there in order to be able to build the needed infrastructure. I think I mentioned that there's 25 billion for airport improvements. That's where some of that comes from. But great question, Aaron, and thanks for allowing me to answer it. Next is from Charlotte. Charlotte, great question, because this is one of the things which has really confused folks. Is there a per mile driving measure in the infrastructure bill? No. There is a section in the bill. Let me give you some background. we may be at all electric vehicles within 20 years. Currently, we finance our roads with a gas tax, but electric vehicles don't pay gas taxes. So there's a project. The bill does not impose a miles traveled vehicle. But what the bill does do, it says, let's have a pilot project. We will refund them the entirety of the gas tax they spend per year. And they can participate in this miles per, vehicular miles traveled. And we're only doing it to try and figure out how we're going to pay for highways in the future when we go to all electric vehicles. Or not. And it doesn't impose, great question, I thank you for asking it, Charlotte. Gas tax. Guy Walker asked about the gas tax. There is no change to the gas tax. Period. End of story. What about inflation? Is there a risk for inflation? Right now, the Biden administration's policies have given us inflation. It is clear. I'm a Republican, and I can tell you I'm being very critical of the president's policies, which are contributing to inflation. Economists do not think that this bill contributes to inflation. Why? Most of the spending is on the backside. It's going to take a while to permit these projects, and so the spending won't, most of it, some of it will, but most of it will not be this year. It'll be next, and then even more in the out years. Number one. They also say that because this addresses bottlenecks in our economy, it actually makes our economy more productive. I once had a fellow tell me, he owns a business, if he had 5 workers stuck in a van in Baton Rouge bridge traffic, going from Baton Rouge over to Dow Plaquemine, that those 5 guys or gals stuck in a van is costing them $50 a worker. And if they're stuck in that van for an hour and a half on that bridge, then he just put all that money, just like putting a match to it. Poof. If he could get them across the bridge faster, it would make him more productive. It would allow him to pay his workers more and to assign them to another job right after, more productive, more pay, actually lowering inflation because he would charge Dow Plaquemine less to get the job done because he's more productive. Now, what I'm saying has been analyzed by the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Wharton School of Business, very famous, very respected. And they did a 3-decade analysis of this bill. And they conclude, and they did 3 decades because it takes a while to build your infrastructure, and the infrastructure, we keep it for decades. And the Wharton School of Business said that over 30 years, this decreases the risk of inflation, and it increases the growth in the economy. Larry Summers is a very respected Democratic economist. I think he was Obama's Secretary of Treasury. He was in the Clinton administration too. He's very critical of Biden's spending spree. He thinks it's contributing to inflation, but he thinks that the infrastructure bill will not contribute to inflation. Others, such as the conservative think tank American Enterprise Institute, agrees with that as well. So on the right and the left, respected economists do not think this bill contributes to inflation. By the way, it's different than the 3.5 trillion. That's going to be, boof, match upon jet fuel. But this, not the case, just to say. Christy, what am I doing about illegals being dropped off into Louisiana? By the way, that's a major concern. As you may have seen on my social media, I've been trying to highlight that, and have had multiple conversations with the people that have control over that, and actually seeing some results from my conversation. As a physician, I raised the concern that they might be contributing to the spread of COVID. And since then, the administration has responded to those criticisms by beginning to change their policies as regards how they address the COVID issue among the immigrants. But Congress has given the president all the tools that he needs to control the border. This president won't do it. We've given him the laws. He won't execute the laws. We put money up to build a wall, and now he has stopped construction of the wall and is spending $3 million a day to protect the assets we have there to build the wall. He would rather spend money to not build the wall than to build the wall. Now, the way our Constitution is, Congress sets up the laws. It is the executive branch that executes. And President Biden will not execute. We're pushing, but we've given him the laws. And so if we want change, let's vote for a Republican Congress in 2022 and a Republican president in 2024. One more thing. If we waited forever for this president to control immigration, we would never do anything else. We just wouldn't. But you got to address other issues while you try and push them to enact the laws that we've given them. But I'm glad you asked that question because it's something that I have been asked recently. Deanna, wait, here's Penny. Mike, will the American people see this money at work? Absolutely. There's an orange cone coming to a city near you. That's true whether it's going to be waterway, clean water, sewer, roads, bridges, ports, and waterways. You're going to see jobs created by this beginning next year, but really beginning to peak over the next several years. One example, I read an article in The Advocate how both Ascension Parish and East Baton Rouge Parish are trying to do something about storm drainage. How do you pay for it was the question in the article. There is $500 million in this bill to help finance low-interest loans for communities that want to make their storm drainage bigger. Now, in 2016, I think literally every parish in the state flooded. And if you get a rainstorm the size that we got in North and South Louisiana separately, the spring and the fall floods, you obviously need bigger capacity in your storm drainage system. I can tell you, we got on the phone, talked to Mayor Broom's staff. We said, listen, there's going to be money coming down the pike. This is money that you can use to apply for to build out the storm drainage system. Mike, I can't go down there and dig the ditch, but I can tell you we're giving the money to the state and the locals in order to begin digging those ditches to expand all these things that this bill is paying for. And along the way, you're going to create, as I said earlier, a lot of jobs, and a lot of people who have jobs are going to get paid better. Deanna, who will be auditing the money each state gets to do exactly what they're supposed to on roads and bridges? How can we be assured states will do what they're supposed to as opposed to that which they're not supposed to? Well, the federal government puts money out there and we audit. When I say we, you and me, the federal taxpayer, we audit to see that states and locals do it right. And if they don't, they got to return the money. We saw that after a couple of our hurricanes where money was misused and money has to be returned. So the federal government has an auditing system to make sure that it is spent correctly. When I say the federal government, the federal taxpayer, you and me. So, anytime you're spending $70 billion a year in infrastructure across the nation, there's going to be something that's not right, but we do have systems to make sure that it is. For example, open contracts. You can't have a contract that is only going to my friend. It has to be a public bid. Multiple people can bid on it. If one of them does not like the contract, then he or she can sue and reopen it to make sure that it's done correctly. So, great question, something we should all be interested in. Chris, what about equity? It's mentioned numerous times in a supposed infrastructure bill. Chris, I am so pleased you asked that. Some people have got on and said this expands critical race theory. This has got nothing to do with critical race theory. Let me tell you what this is about. If somebody gets a grant from the federal government to provide internet service to those who don't have it currently, there's $65 billion to provide broadband internet service to communities that don't have it, internet service. You're going to give it to the rich people first because they're the ones that you can upsell. You're going to make most of your money off of businesses and well-to-do neighborhoods. And then at the end, you start serving those folks who are out in the country or who maybe don't have as much money, and you're going to serve them second, but you're going to start off with the richer people. This legislation says, wait a second, you're getting a grant from the federal taxpayer. You got to give it to everybody equally with equity, and that's where it comes in. And there's a standard non-discrimination language that's already in federal law that shows up in this bill, just to make sure that somebody getting money from the federal government spends it wisely, equally, for all. Kind of going back to Deanna's question, there has to be accountability. We don't want any American discriminated against when it comes to providing broadband services. So that's where the word equity comes from. Chris, thanks for asking that question. From Will. What can be done if the House tries to add partisan programs or spending to the newly passed infrastructure bill? Ideally, they only minimally change that. If they add too much, it has to come back and be voted on by the Senate, at which point the Republicans that voted for it would vote against it. So we tried to get a package that would not need to be changed by the House. But to your point, if they do, the Republicans that voted for it would then oppose. But you know, the old Ronald Reagan quoting of a Russian proverb, trust but verify. Maybe you don't quite trust, but you still verify. And that will be part of our process going forward. By the way, that's why it would be very good that Republican members of Congress support the bill. If no Republican supports it on the other side, Republicans have no leverage. The squad's going to be against it. The squad wants to link it with the $3.5 trillion bill because they think it makes the $3.5 trillion more likely to pass. So you're losing the squad's vote. That's what I'm being told. So you want to have Republicans also supporting, because that gives us leverage to make sure that kind of foolishness does not occur. Thanks. Paul, who's paying for all this? Great question, because one of the questions is this adding to the debt and deficit? So we've always said, of the new spending, which is $550 billion, so new spending, of the new spending, about half of it is going to be things that the Congressional Budget Office gives us credit for. Yeah, you're right. CBO says, yeah, we give you credit for it. We repurpose money that has been previously allocated for COVID, which is not being used for COVID. We repurpose that money. There's a provision that would require better reporting for assets, so that people who are currently, frankly, not paying taxes on some assets, doesn't raise their taxes. It just asks them to report it, and that reporting generates more money. There's other things like that, but we don't touch the Tax Cut and Jobs Act bill Republicans passed in, I think, 2017. We don't raise your income tax. We don't raise the gas tax. We don't put a vehicular miles tax, travel tax. We don't increase small business taxes, etc., income taxes. So we don't touch that. We repurpose dollars and get money where it already is, if you will, with one exception, which I can go into. And by the way, there is no mileage tax, because my next question is from Deborah about mileage tax, and so there is no mileage tax, and so just to say that, there's half of the bill that we said, listen, CBO is not going to give us credit for, but we think a reasonable person would consider this to pay for. For example, Congress allocated money for supplemental payments for the federal unemployment insurance program. Some states, such as Louisiana, are not using all that money. It's about $53 billion. What we're saying is, Congress has allocated this money. The states are not using it. We are going for unemployment. States are not using it. So we're going to apply it to this program. Instead of paying people unemployment insurance, they're going to get a better job. I think kind of a nice that's a better way to use the money. And so we get 53 billion. CBO does not give us credit for that. They just don't. But any reasonable person would say, because their rules won't allow them, would say, Congress has kind of allocated that, and you're going to be using it on this, but it's already out the door. That seems pretty reasonable. That 53 billion is okay. The second thing to say, there's also going to be economic growth stimulated by this. One example, there was a guy that wanted to set up a business in Wynn Parish, and he told me he couldn't set it up until they had broadband internet. He was a distribution supply company. It was perfectly located between Monroe, Ruston, Alexandria, Fort Polk, Shreveport, all that Bossier, and he wanted to set up in Wynn, but he didn't have broadband. This will introduce broadband in areas Parish will begin to see growth that it doesn't have now. Now, I think he actually worked it out, but that gives a good example of other communities. And so there's going to be economic growth created by this. I mentioned earlier the Wharton School of Business studying the effects of this bill over 30 years, and they found that over 30 years, this bill increases the size. There are things that I'm just not interested in. For example, there is $7.5 billion that the president insisted upon for electric vehicle charging stations. Now, I wouldn't have put money in there for that, but the president said he wasn't going to sign the bill unless we had it. So wait a second. I don't get money for coastal restoration, and I don't get money for dredging the Red River, and I don't get money for ports, and I don't get money for flood mitigation unless I give the president money for EV charging stations. Well, every now and then you take a little bit of something you don't want in order to get a lot more that you do. Ronald Reagan had the 80-20 rule. Ronald Reagan said, give me 80% of what I want, and I'll give you 20%. And I was willing to do that. But by the way, that EV charging station is going to be in a rural area that may, or not a rural area, but an area where you don't imagine there being a lot of electric vehicles. So think of a way station on I-49, somewhere between Alexandria and Opelousas, where I can stop and charge if I have an electric vehicle. I don't. So that I can drive all the way from Lafayette to Shreveport on the I-49. And so that's where those will be, because you see that the companies are already putting electric vehicle charging stations in the city. The Holiday Inn in downtown Alexandria, Tesla has a charging station right there as an example. So this will go in those rural areas that will allow people to, if they have an electric vehicle, to take those long trips that can, but otherwise still get service. Next question is from Stephanie. Will Lake Charles get the assistance they've requested? Of course, if you're not from Southwest Louisiana, you may not be familiar, but this is related to the community development block grant that Lake Charles desperately needs to finish their recovery, Southwest Louisiana. I spoke to the president yesterday, Stephanie. He gave me his commitment that he would continue to work to get that funding for Southwest Louisiana. And we've also continued to work with the Appropriations Committee in the Senate in order to achieve that. It's long overdue, but we're going to get it. It's just a question of when, and I continue to work for it. It's not in this bill because it's not infrastructure. Senator Kennedy put up an amendment, I supported it, but again, folks said it's not infrastructure, so it didn't pass. On the other hand, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get this. After I spoke to the president, by the way, I emailed Nick Hunter to let him know. Nick and I have been in constant communication. He's represented very well the needs of Southwest Louisiana. We continue to work on that. Next, I should also mention there's $109 million in this bill to affect those waterways. For example, Calcasieu Ship Channel affected by hurricanes Laura and Delta. So there's money in here specifically going to the Army Corps to address dredging needs of Lake Charles area for the post-Delta Hurricane Laura situation. One thing that will help Lake Charles recover is if there's more economic activity from the business and industry which is there, and there is money directly in there to help Lake Charles further recover. Mike, why did you support this knowing that there is a $3.5 trillion bill that can be passed through reconciliation. Mike, you may not have been on when I was on earlier, but I think, and by the way, Mitch McConnell agrees with me, and Mitch McConnell is a pretty good analyst of politics in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress, that passing this bill makes it less likely to pass the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. Pelosi clearly does not have the votes for the $3.5 trillion package. And she's trying to tie the two together to try and make it so that she can pass the $3.5 trillion. So think about that. Folks say this makes it more likely to pass the bill we all hate if you're a conservative, which is the $3.5 trillion package. And then folks say, but wait a second, she's going to tie them together in order to pass the $3.5 trillion. We could have just, or they could have just rolled the two together. That's what the people on the far left wanted. They wanted them both to be tied at the beginning because they think it's more likely to pass the $3.5 trillion. With this bill, it's broken apart. Now, those that say, wait a second, if she ties it together once more, she's more likely to pass it, that's accepting the logic that breaking them apart makes it less likely that she passes the $3.5 trillion package. Again, Mitch McConnell, who's probably the best Republican analyst, says that breaking them apart makes it less likely they pass the $3.5 trillion. I'll repeat what I said earlier, quoting one of my Democratic colleagues. He said, you know, the 1.2 infrastructure package is the dessert. The 3.5 trillion is the spinach. Why would I eat my spinach if I've already had my dessert? We can't promise, but that's, I think, the better logic. Patrick, is North Louisiana going to benefit? Or is it business as usual, all going south? Patrick, great question, man. Of course, the state establishes priorities. And so the fight is the money goes to the state. The state then splits it up. But I-49 North was very much on my thinking as regards what can we do that would benefit North Louisiana. Also, North and Central Louisiana have a higher collection of parishes which have no internet broadband whatsoever. So when it comes to the distribution of broadband funding for parishes which have no internet connection or very poor internet connection, this money disproportionately goes to the North. Also, there's $55 billion for sewer and clean water programs that every town, every parish can apply for. And I just remember those pictures. I got calls from friends in Shreveport after the winter storm where the pipes busted and the water was frozen and they couldn't fix the pipes. And everybody was affected, rich and poor. There is money that municipalities, parishes can access in order to address those sorts of issues. I mentioned already there's money for the Mississippi River and tributary systems, $800 million. That includes the Red River that constantly needs dredging, as does our other rivers. There's money for ports, which the port of Shreveport-Bossier can access, as can the ports in Monroe and the port in Alexandria, etc. And so all these dollars are available for communities north and south. There will be people employed in North, Central, and South Louisiana with better jobs or better paying jobs because of this bill. I can promise you that. Key, is there amnesty in the bill for illegals? No! Period. End of story. And that's been one of the things I've gotten. But there's not. That's just kind of the things being said that just are not true. And so thank you for asking that. I really appreciate it. There is no amnesty for illegals. Now, by the way, the $3.5 trillion package, the one that we hate if you're a conservative, they may try and slip it in there, but it's not in ours. How will it affect our rural constituents? I think that's what Alexis's question is. It affects you very positively. If you're rural, quite likely you don't have broadband. And until you get broadband, your children don't have access to online education. Until you have broadband, you don't have access to telehealth or telemental health. So some of this is specifically written with rural areas in mind. For example, the $65 billion going for rural broadband. Next is a question: how do lithium mines affect the environment and the planet? This is a good question. There is money in there for critical mineral mining. Right now, we are dependent upon China for critical minerals. We have critical minerals that we can mine in the United States, but environmental regulations have wrapped it all up in a knot. So instead of mining our own, we're dependent upon China, who goes to a country like the Congo in Africa, standards, uses child labor, brings the minerals back to China to process using coal-fired energy with SOx and NOx and other things, and then they ship it to us. We don't want to be dependent upon China, which uses child labor and pollutes the atmosphere. And so this tries to facilitate the mining of minerals in the United States with our worker protections, with our labor force, creating jobs along the way so that we become self-sufficient. So it positively affects the environment because we have U.S. labor environmental laws. So great question. I think it helps us in many regards. Wayne, why am I voting for something that has little to do with infrastructure? And what happened to the gas tax? There's supposed to be a highway trust fund. So Wayne, the money from the gas tax is being used. So keep in mind, there's two parts to this. There is the regular infrastructure bill, and then there's $550 billion on top of it. The gas tax that you and I pay into is used for this regular infrastructure bill. All that money is being used. And secondly, you must not have been on earlier, and obviously people are joining as the call goes on. This has there's a myth out there that only 10%, only 23%, only 30% is going for infrastructure. I gave a list at the top, clearly over 30%, and I could keep on going. So just a quick list. And these are all jobs. When I say this amount of money for infrastructure, think about how many people are going to have better jobs and better paying jobs as we fulfill this. $110 billion for roads, $40 billion for bridges, $17 billion for roads of regional significance, $65 billion for hardening the grid, $65 billion for rural broadband, $50 billion for resiliency, including $17 billion for the Army Corps of Engineers. Included in that is $4.5 billion for coastal restoration type activities, including those that benefit specifically communities that have been hit by natural disasters in the last 10 years, the last 6 years. Clearly that's Louisiana. $4.5 billion going to FEMA for flood mitigation, benefiting communities which are at increased risk for flooding. Think of every parish in Louisiana. $50 billion for clean water and sewer systems. That's pretty good, isn't it? There's, by the way, $53 million to help out Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain has been getting so much dumped into it from the Bonnet-Carré Spillway open. There's actually $50 million to help the Bonnet-Carré. I could keep on going. But there is more, there is so much infrastructure in here. There's about, there's a lot of money for infrastructure. Let me stop it there. And so, last question, because I have to, my staff is telling me I got to move. How do I dispute Senator Hagerty? I'm not sure what he said, but how can I read the entire bill in a short time with no discussion? First, portions of this bill have been out there for months, for weeks. Different committees passed their legislation 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Now, if you're reading the legislation as it comes out, you could read the legislation. There's 4 different committees that added stuff to it, plus our individual effort. What we do is you split it up. My staff and I, we split it up. We each read it, we reread it, we go back through it, we discuss it, you break it down, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. I think Senator Haggerty said something about, and by the way, as I said, if you started reading 2 months ago when the bill came out of committee, then you had a head start. But if you don't start reading it until it comes out a 4th time, well then maybe you don't have time to read it. But if you start doing your homework 2 months ago, you get it done. I was sent up here to do a job. I hire people that want to work. We got it done. I think Senator Haggerty said something about increasing the debt and deficit. I mentioned that before. I'll say it again. CBO says about half of it's paid for in a way that they can agree with. Half of it's paid for in a way their rules don't allow agreeing with, but reasonable people would say, yeah, I see where you're going with that. I accept that. And if you look at the economic impact, the Wharton School of Business did a 30-year analysis. The Wharton School of Business, very famous, very respected, and they say because of this bill, in 30 years, because that's how long it takes to build, and of course this infrastructure helps over 30 years, the economy grows and the debt and deficit decreases. Now, I can't speak to anything else he said, but what I try and do is push back with facts. I don't give you rhetoric. I give you things that you can go and say, he's right. Oh yeah, I can see that Wharton School of Business analysis. Oh yes, I can see that $53 billion being repurposed from federal unemployment insurance. Oh yes, I can see that we're getting $6 billion for roads and bridges, of which $1.2 billion is money we wouldn't otherwise receive. And I can imagine what rural broadband will mean for my parish. If I can give you facts, past the rhetoric, then I just trust you to make the right decisions. Thank you for being on Facebook Live. It is a privilege to serve the people of Louisiana and the people of the United States of America. And I look forward to being able to do so even more so, and I look forward to a ribbon cutting in a town near yours. Thanks.